Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I lived in Florida back in 2018. The memory of that night still haunts me, even now. I was 16 then, full of the kind of bravado that only comes with youth and ignorance. To understand what happened, you need to know who I was and where this took place. I've always been drawn to the supernatural. While other kids my age were obsessing over social media and video games, I spent countless hours researching cryptids, reading accounts of unexplained encounters, and diving deep into forums dedicated to the paranormal. My bedroom walls were covered with printouts of blurry photographs and hand-drawn sketches of creatures that supposedly lurked just beyond the edge of human understanding. My fascination wasn't entirely academic. My mother practiced a form of modern paganism, what some might call witchcraft. Though she always emphasized it was the benevolent kind, she had taught me to respect the unseen world, to understand that there were forces beyond our comprehension that deserved both caution and reverence. Our house was filled with crystals, herbs hung to dry, and the gentle scent of sage that she burned during her evening rituals. We lived on a dead-end gravel road in a heavily wooded area about 30 minutes outside of Gainesville. The property stretched across 1.6 acres of cleared land, but beyond our mowed lawn lay thousands of acres of dense Florida wilderness. Pine trees, palmetto bushes, and tangled undergrowth created a wall of vegetation so thick that even during daylight you couldn't see more than a few dozen feet into the tree line. Our nearest neighbors were scattered, their houses barely visible through the trees. The Hendersons lived about a quarter-mile down the road, and old Mrs. Kowalski had a trailer hidden behind a grove of oak trees. The isolation was both comforting and unsettling. During the day it felt peaceful, private, but as darkness fell, that same isolation took on a more sinister quality. The road itself was barely wide enough for two cars to pass. A single streetlight stood like a lone beacon about halfway between our house and the main road, casting a weak yellow glow that only seemed to emphasize how dark everything else was. Beyond its feeble reach, the night swallowed everything whole. About 500 feet up the road from our house sat a small cabin that my parents rented out to family friends. The Johnsons had been living there for almost 2 years. A young couple with a baby who kept to themselves most of the time. The cabin was modest, with a screened porch and a small yard that butted right up against the woods. On this particular evening in late October, the Johnsons were hosting what they called a small get-together. My parents, along with my older siblings Cameron and Tessa, had walked up there around 6 o'clock. I could hear the music drifting down through the trees, classic rock mixed with the occasional burst of laughter and conversation. My little sister Melody, who was only 8, had begged to go with them, but Mom had insisted she stay home. "It's a grown-up party," she'd said, though I suspected it was more about the drinking that would inevitably happen. Melody had pouted for about 10 minutes before settling in front of the television with a bowl of popcorn and one of her princess movies. I should have been content to stay inside, maybe work on some homework, or continue reading about the recent Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest that I'd found on a paranormal website. But something had been bothering me all day, a restless energy that made it impossible to sit still. The air itself seemed charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm when every hair on your body stands on end. By 7 o'clock, Melody had fallen asleep on the couch, her small body curled up under the throw blanket Mom had knitted the previous winter. The television was still playing her movie, the colorful animation casting shifting patterns of light across her peaceful face. The house felt too quiet, too still. Even with the distant sounds of the party, there was something oppressive about the silence. That's when I decided to go outside. I told myself I was just going to let Buster, our German Shepherd mix, out for his evening bathroom break. But truthfully, I was drawn by something I couldn't name, a compulsion to step out into the darkness that surrounded our home. The moment I opened the front door, I knew something was wrong. Buster, who normally bounded outside at the first opportunity, stopped dead at the threshold. His ears were pinned back against his head, and a low, continuous growl rumbled in his throat. His eyes were fixed on the tree line, and every muscle in his body was tense. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, but he wouldn't move. He just stood there, hackles raised, staring into the darkness beyond our yard. I'd never seen him act this way before. Buster was typically fearless, chasing after raccoons and barking at the occasional coyote that wandered too close to the house. I stepped out onto the porch, leaving Buster inside. The October air was humid and heavy, unusual for the season. Normally by late October, Florida would have cooled down at least a little, but tonight felt almost tropical. The air was so thick it was difficult to breathe deeply, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. The sounds from the party up at the cabin seemed muffled, distant. Even the normal nighttime chorus of insects and tree frogs was subdued. It was as if the entire forest was holding back, waiting for something to happen. I walked to the edge of our yard, where the mowed grass gave way to the wild undergrowth. Our usual bonfire spot was about 100 feet into the woods, in a small clearing that my father had made years ago. We'd spent countless evenings there, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. During the day, it was one of my favorite places on the property. But now, staring into that impenetrable darkness, the bonfire clearing felt like the mouth of some enormous hungry beast. That's when I heard it. A sound that made every instinct in my body scream in alarm. It wasn't the familiar rustling of a small animal moving through the underbrush. This was heavy, deliberate movement. Something large was making its way through the woods, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. The sound came again, closer this time. Branches snapped under weight. Not the quick crack of a twig beneath a rabbit's foot, but the prolonged groan and snap of substantial limbs being crushed. Whatever was moving out there was big, much bigger than any native Florida wildlife had a right to be. I knew these woods intimately. I'd been exploring them since I was old enough to walk. I knew the difference between a raccoon's scrambling movement and a deer's careful steps. I'd heard black bears passing through on rare occasions, their heavy shuffling gait unmistakable. This was none of those things. The movement was too purposeful, too controlled. It reminded me of a person walking through the woods, but the weight behind each step suggested something much larger and heavier than any human. The spacing of the footfalls was wrong too far apart, as if whatever was walking had an unnaturally long stride. My heart began to pound, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Part of it was teenage stubbornness. I'd spent so many years reading about encounters with unknown creatures that I felt prepared for something like this. But there was something else keeping me rooted to the spot, a horrible fascination that overrode my growing fear. The movement stopped. In the sudden silence, I became acutely aware of every sound. My own labored breathing, the distant music from the cabin, the barely perceptible hum of the streetlight up the road. But from the woods, nothing. Even the insects had gone completely quiet. I strained my eyes, trying to penetrate the darkness between the trees. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing almost no illumination. The shadows beneath the canopy were absolute, impenetrable. I might as well have been staring into a cave. Then I saw them. Two pale, luminous discs appeared in the darkness, roughly where a person's eyes would be if they were standing among the trees at the edge of our property. But they were too high off the ground, at least 7 feet up, maybe more, and they glowed with a sickly phosphorescent light that reminded me of the foxfire fungus that sometimes grew on rotting logs. The eyes, for that's what they had to be, didn't blink. They simply stared, fixed and unmoving, directly at me. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to get inside the house and lock the door, but I couldn't move. The eyes held me transfixed, and beneath my terror, a strange realization was dawning. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't moved past the tree line. I thought about my mother's protective rituals, the salt she sometimes scattered around our property, the small cloth bags filled with herbs that she hung from fence posts. She'd never explicitly told me she was creating a barrier, but now I wondered if that's exactly what she'd been doing all these years. The eyes continued to stare, unblinking and patient. There was an intelligence behind them, a calculating awareness that was more terrifying than any mindless beast would have been. This thing was thinking, evaluating, planning. Minutes passed. The standoff continued. Then, cutting through the oppressive silence, came a voice. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. The sound seemed to emerge from the very trees themselves, low and rasping, as if vocal cords designed for human speech were being used by something that had never been human. The words came slowly, deliberately, each syllable forced out with obvious effort. Jordan. The sound of my own name spoken in that terrible voice made my knees buckle. How could it possibly know who I was? I'd never seen this thing before, never encountered anything like it. Yet it knew me, had somehow learned my name. "Come here, Jordan." The words carried an awful weight, a compulsion that pressed against my mind like physical pressure. Part of me wanted to obey, to walk forward into those woods, to approach whatever was waiting there among the trees. It would be so easy to just take a few steps forward, to cross that invisible line and find out what this creature wanted. "I don't want to hurt you." The voice was becoming clearer, more defined, as if the thing was learning how to use human speech even as it spoke. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the intonation, the rhythm. It sounded like someone reading words from a script without understanding their meaning. I tried to speak, to respond, but no sound came out. My throat had closed up completely, and my tongue felt thick and useless in my mouth. Standing there in my own yard, frozen with terror, but somehow still safe behind whatever protection my mother had established, I felt a flicker of my usual 16-year-old arrogance beginning to surface. I'd spent years studying creatures like this, reading accounts of encounters and analyzing behaviors. I thought I understood what I was dealing with. The glowing eyes remained fixed on me, and the voice came again, more insistent this time. "Come here." A pause. "Come here, Jordan. Come here. Come here. Come here." The repetition was hypnotic, almost mechanical. It reminded me of the descriptions I'd read of certain Native American legends, creatures that could mimic human speech but didn't truly understand language, things that stole voices and used them like tools. My fear was gradually being replaced by anger. How dare this thing come to my home, to my family's property, and try to lure me into the woods? How dare it use my name, speak to me with that horrible borrowed voice? I looked around and spotted a rock near the edge of our flower bed, about the size of a baseball. Before I could think about what I was doing, I bent down and picked it up. The weight of it in my hand was comforting, solid and real in a night that had become increasingly surreal. "Get out of here," I shouted, surprised by the strength of my own voice. "Get away from my home." I drew back my arm and hurled the rock as hard as I could toward those glowing eyes. The stone disappeared into the darkness, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I'd hit anything. The eyes didn't move, didn't react. Then came the scream. It wasn't a sound that any earthly creature could make. It started low, almost subsonic, a vibration that I felt in my bones before I heard it. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a piercing shriek that seemed to drill directly into my brain. The sound was so intense, so overwhelming, that I clapped my hands over my ears and fell to my knees. The scream went on, rising and falling like an air raid siren. Windows rattled in their frames. Car alarms began going off in the distance. Dogs throughout the neighborhood began howling in response, their voices adding to the hellish chorus. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, I heard a sound that made my heart stop, the whistle of something moving through the air at tremendous speed. The rock I had thrown, or something very much like it, whizzed past my head so close that I felt the wind of its passage. It struck the side of our house with a tremendous crash, leaving what I would later discover was a crater in the wooden siding. The force behind that throw was impossible. No human being, no matter how strong, could have hurled a stone with that kind of velocity. The thing in the woods had caught my rock and returned it with the power of a major league pitcher. Or maybe a cannon. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the front door, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stay upright. Behind me I could hear movement in the woods again, but this time it was different. The careful stalking movements had been replaced by something frantic, violent. Trees were crashing down. The sound of splintering wood filled the air. I burst through the front door and slammed it behind me, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the chain lock into place. Melody was sitting up on the couch now, rubbing her eyes and looking confused. "Jordan, what was that noise? It woke me up." I forced myself to take deep breaths, to appear calm, even though every nerve in my body was screaming. Melody didn't need to see me like this. She didn't need to know what was out there in the woods. "Just some animals fighting," I managed to say, surprised at how normal my voice sounded. "Go back to sleep." But sleep was the last thing on my mind. I went to every window in the house, checking that they were locked, pulling the curtains closed. The sounds from outside continued for several more minutes, crashing, splintering, what might have been howling in the distance. Then gradually everything went quiet again. I retreated to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closed curtains and trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my mind was already beginning to doubt what I'd seen and heard. Maybe it had been a bear after all, or a large boar. Maybe the phosphorescent eyes had been a trick of light and shadow. Maybe the voice had been my imagination, fueled by too many late nights reading about cryptids and monsters. But I knew better. I'd seen what I'd seen, heard what I'd heard. Something had been out there. Something that knew my name and wanted me to come into the woods. Something with the strength to throw a rock hard enough to crater the side of a house. I stayed awake until I heard the sounds of my family returning from the party. Car doors slamming, voices calling goodnight to the Johnsons, the familiar sound of my parents' footsteps on the gravel driveway. Only then did I begin to relax, to feel truly safe again. When everyone had settled in for the night, I found my mother in the kitchen, cleaning up the few dishes that had been left in the sink. She looked tired but content, the way she always did after spending an evening with friends. Without really knowing why, I walked over and hugged her tightly, squeezing her as if I hadn't seen her in months, instead of just a few hours. "Thank you," I whispered into her shoulder. She hugged me back, but I could feel her confusion. "Thank you for what, sweetie?" "For protecting us. For protecting the family." She pulled back to look at me, her eyes searching my face. "Jordan, what happened tonight?" But I couldn't tell her. Not then. Not while the terror was still so fresh. Not while I could still hear that awful voice calling my name. Instead, I just hugged her again and said, "I don't want to talk about it right now." She didn't push, didn't demand an explanation. She simply held me until I was ready to let go. It would be years before I finally told her the whole story. Years before I learned that she had indeed been maintaining protective barriers around our property, that the herbs and salt and carefully spoken words had been holding something at bay. She wasn't entirely surprised by my account, though the details clearly disturbed her. "I always felt like there was something in those woods," she admitted. "Something that didn't belong there. I hoped the protections would be enough to keep it away from the house." They had been enough. Whatever that thing was, it couldn't cross the invisible line my mother had drawn around our home. But it had been out there, waiting, watching, learning our names and our routines. And if I had been foolish enough to step beyond that protective boundary, I still live in Florida, though I've moved far from those woods. I've never encountered anything like that creature again, and I hope I never will. But sometimes, on particularly dark nights when the air is thick and heavy, I find myself remembering those glowing eyes and that terrible voice. And I always make sure my doors are locked, my windows are secure, and my protective charms are in place. Because somewhere out there, in the deep woods where the streetlights can't reach, there are things that know our names and wait for us to make a mistake. The thing in the woods taught me that some boundaries should never be crossed, and some invitations should never be accepted, no matter how curious you might be about what's waiting in the darkness. I learned that lesson well, and I'm still alive to tell this story because of it. I'd never been comfortable sleeping outdoors, but my partner Jordan had been persistent about this trip. We'd been planning the Olympic National Park bikepacking expedition for months, poring over trail maps and gear lists during long winter evenings. The old Olympic Hot Springs Trail had caught our attention, remote, challenging, and largely abandoned since the access road had been damaged by landslides in 2017. Perfect for the kind of solitude we craved away from the crowded campgrounds and tourist-heavy trails. The drive from Seattle took longer than expected. Winding mountain roads slick with February rain forcing us to crawl through hairpin turns. By the time we reached the trailhead, afternoon shadows were already stretching across the gravel parking lot. Only two other vehicles sat empty, a battered pickup truck and a dusty sedan with Washington plates. The absence of crowds felt both liberating and somehow ominous. Jordan shouldered his pack with practiced efficiency, while I fumbled with my bike's pannier system, nervous energy making my fingers clumsy. The forest loomed around us, towering Douglas firs and western red cedars creating a cathedral of green that seemed to swallow sound. Even our voices felt muted, absorbed by the dense canopy overhead. The air carried the rich scent of decomposing leaves and moss, that particular Pacific Northwest smell that always reminded me of decay and rebirth happening simultaneously. We began our ride into the wilderness as the first drops of evening rain began to fall, tiny pinpricks on our faces that promised a wet night ahead. The abandoned trail was rougher than the maps had indicated, forcing us to dismount frequently to navigate fallen logs and washouts. Each obstacle slowed our progress, and I found myself glancing anxiously at my watch as daylight continued to fade. Jordan seemed unbothered by the delays, stopping frequently to point out interesting fungi or unusual rock formations, but I felt in growing urgency to reach our planned campsite before full darkness fell. We reached the Boulder Creek area just as the last traces of natural light disappeared behind the mountain ridge. Our headlamps carved narrow tunnels through the black air as we searched for a suitable campsite. The sound of running water guided us toward the creek, where we found a small clearing nestled between massive tree trunks. The spot felt protected, surrounded by ancient cedars whose branches formed a natural canopy overhead. Jordan immediately began the familiar ritual of setting up camp, clearing rocks and debris, laying out our tent footprint, assembling poles with methodical precision. I busied myself with unpacking our gear, but my hands shook slightly as I organized our supplies. Something about this place felt different from other backcountry sites we'd used. The darkness seemed thicker here, more oppressive, as if the trees were pressing closer than they should. The creek babbled nearby, a constant white noise that should have been comforting but instead masked other sounds I couldn't identify. Occasional rustling came from the underbrush, probably mice or squirrels, but each noise made me freeze momentarily, listening intently for threats that never materialized. Jordan noticed my jumpiness and gently ribbed me about my city nerves, but even his usual confidence seemed slightly forced tonight. We cooked a simple dinner over our camp stove, the blue flame casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The warm food helped settle my nerves somewhat, and Jordan's steady presence reminded me why I'd agreed to this adventure in the first place. He had a way of making the wilderness feel manageable, his years of outdoor experience lending authority to his calm demeanor, but even he seemed to eat quickly, eager to retreat to the safety of our tent. As we cleaned up and stored our food in the bear canister, I noticed how complete the darkness had become. Our headlamps revealed only small circles of detail, a fern here, a moss-covered log there, while everything beyond remained utterly black. The forest felt vast and unknowable around us, stretching endlessly in all directions. When Jordan announced he was ready for bed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Inside our tent zipped securely against the night, I felt marginally safer. The familiar routine of arranging our sleeping bags and organizing our gear for the morning provided welcome distraction from the oppressive darkness outside. Jordan fell asleep quickly, his breathing settling into the deep, regular rhythm I'd grown accustomed to over years of camping together. I lay awake longer, hyper-aware of every sound penetrating the thin nylon walls. The creek's constant murmur should have been soothing, but instead it seemed to amplify every other noise, the drip of condensation from branches, the distant crack of settling timber, the occasional rustle that might have been wind or might have been something moving through the underbrush. Each sound sent a jolt of alertness through my system, making sleep feel impossible. Around midnight, I finally began to drift off, lulled by Jordan's steady breathing and the rhythmic sound of light rain beginning to fall on the tent fly. But my rest was fitful, interrupted by dreams of being watched by invisible eyes, of voices calling from empty spaces between the trees. I woke several times, disoriented and anxious, reaching out to confirm Jordan's reassuring presence beside me. The rain intensified during the early morning hours, drumming harder against our shelter. The sound was oddly comforting, creating a cocoon of white noise that seemed to push back against the forest's oppressive silence. But even through the rain, I occasionally caught other sounds, distant snapping of branches, soft thuds that might have been falling debris, and once, what sounded distinctly like footsteps circling our campsite. Each time I fully awakened to investigate, Jordan slept on undisturbed, and the sounds would fade away, leaving me uncertain whether I'd actually heard anything, or simply imagined threats in the boundary between sleep and wakefulness. By the time genuine dawn began to approach, I had given up on meaningful rest entirely, lying tense and alert, waiting for enough light to justify leaving the tent. I emerged from the tent around 5 in the morning, the sky still dark, but showing the faint gray promise of approaching sunrise. The rain had stopped, leaving everything dripping and glistening in the beam of my headlamp. The air felt thick with moisture and the smell of wet earth, that distinctly northwestern scent of a forest after heavy rain. Jordan remained asleep, exhausted from the previous day's long ride and untroubled by the anxiety that had kept me awake. Moving quietly to avoid waking him, I stepped carefully around our campsite, noting how different everything looked in the pre-dawn gloom. The massive cedar trees that had seemed protective in daylight now loomed like dark giants, their trunks disappearing upward into impenetrable blackness. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every dark space between trees felt like it might conceal watching eyes. I needed to relieve myself, but hesitated at the thought of walking to the pit toilet, which sat roughly 100 feet away down a narrow trail. In the darkness, that distance felt enormous, fraught with possibilities for stumbling or encountering something unexpected. Instead, I decided to step just outside our immediate campsite, into a thick patch of undergrowth that would provide adequate privacy while keeping me close to the tent's safety. As I moved through the brush, switching off my headlamp to preserve my night vision, my ears caught something that made me freeze completely. Soft voices, definitely human, drifting up from somewhere below our campsite. The sound was unmistakable. Quiet conversation. The gentle murmur of people talking in hushed tones. Relief flooded through me as I realized we weren't alone out here after all. Straining to locate the source, I peered downward through the darkness toward what appeared to be a small ravine about 50 feet below our position. There, barely visible in the shadows, something reflective caught what little light was available. A sleeping bag, or perhaps an emergency blanket, the telltale sign of fellow campers who had chosen to sleep under the stars rather than in a tent. The voices continued, rising and falling in the rhythm of intimate conversation between companions. Feeling somewhat foolish for my earlier paranoia, I completed my business and headed back toward the tent, my tension easing considerably. Jordan was beginning to stir as I quietly slipped back inside, and we exchanged sleepy good mornings as we began the familiar process of breaking camp. I mentioned the nearby campers in a whisper, and Jordan nodded drowsily, equally relieved to know we had neighbors in this remote location. We worked efficiently in the growing light, rolling sleeping bags and stuffing gear into panniers with the practiced movements of experienced cycle tourists. The sky gradually lightened from black to deep gray, though the thick canopy overhead meant our immediate surroundings remained shadowy and indistinct. Neither of us spoke loudly, respecting the apparent rest of our fellow campers somewhere below in the ravine. Then, from directly above us, came a sound that shattered the morning peace entirely. Crack. The noise was explosive, sharp as a gunshot, emanating from the massive cedar tree that stood perhaps 10 feet from our tent. Both Jordan and I froze, heads snapping upward, expecting to see a large branch falling, or some obvious explanation for such a violent sound. But the tree stood perfectly still, its branches motionless in the windless air. No debris fell, nothing moved. A second crack followed immediately, even louder than the first. Then a third. The sounds were rhythmic now, deliberate, like something enormous moving through the upper branches with destructive force. Jordan grabbed his headlamp and aimed its beam upward into the canopy, the circle of light revealing only empty branches and darkness beyond. The cracking continued, growing in intensity and frequency. "What the hell?" Jordan whispered, his voice tight with concern. The sounds were impossible to ignore or rationalize. Deep, splintering cracks that suggested massive weight shifting among branches that remained completely stationary. I felt my heart rate accelerate, adrenaline surging as my mind raced to find explanations that simply didn't exist. The noise intensified suddenly, becoming a barrage of sharp reports interspersed with what sounded like heavy objects crashing through foliage. Yet nothing fell. No branches broke away from the tree. The massive cedar stood as motionless as a photograph while chaos erupted from its supposedly empty crown. "Maybe it's a bear," Jordan suggested uncertainly, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. Bears don't remain invisible while making that kind of noise. I retrieved the bear spray from my pack, holding it ready while we both continued to stare upward at the source of the impossible sounds. The cracking had become nearly constant now, a relentless assault on our nerves that seemed to grow more aggressive with each passing moment. "Let's try to scare it off," I said, my voice betraying a tremor I couldn't suppress. We began clapping loudly, shouting up at the tree, making as much noise as possible to frighten away whatever creature might be hidden in the branches above us. But our efforts seemed to have the opposite effect. The cracking sounds intensified in response to our noise, becoming almost violent in their intensity. Nothing fled. Nothing showed itself. The tree remained perfectly still while sounds of destruction continued to pour from its crown. I felt a deep, primal terror beginning to claw its way up from my stomach, the kind of fear that bypasses rational thought and speaks directly to ancient survival instincts. This wasn't right. This wasn't natural. Everything about the situation violated basic principles of cause and effect. Jordan's face had gone pale in the light of our headlamps. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly, and I nodded immediately. We began throwing our gear together with desperate efficiency, no longer concerned about being quiet or methodical. The cracking sounds followed our movements, seeming to respond to our activity with increased aggression. As we rolled our tent and secured it to Jordan's bike, I glanced toward the ravine where I'd seen the reflective material earlier. Dawn light was beginning to filter through the trees now, providing enough visibility to see more clearly. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. There was no sleeping bag down there, no emergency blanket, no campers at all. The reflective surface I'd mistaken for camping gear was nothing more than aluminum drainage pipes protruding from beneath an old trail marker, catching stray light from my headlamp. The voices I'd heard, the gentle conversation that had provided such comfort, had never existed. We had been completely alone in these woods all along. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If there were no other campers, then whose voices had I heard in the darkness? The question gnawed at me as we hurriedly loaded our bikes, hands shaking from both cold and fear. The cracking sounds from the cedar tree continued unabated, now seeming to mock our desperate preparations to leave. Jordan moved toward the pit toilet, muttering that he needed to go before our ride out. I wanted to beg him not to leave me alone, but pride kept me silent. The moment he disappeared from view, the sounds from the tree exploded into a frenzy of violence. The cracking became a continuous roar, as if enormous branches were being torn apart by invisible hands. I stood frozen in terror, staring up at the motionless tree, while sounds of destruction poured down from its utterly still crown. "Get away!" I screamed at the tree, my voice breaking with desperation. "Leave us alone!" The sounds paused for exactly one heartbeat, then resumed with even greater intensity, as if my fear was feeding whatever malevolent force had taken residence in the ancient cedar. I backed away from the tree, my hand gripping the bear spray so tightly my knuckles ached. The moment Jordan reappeared at my side, the sound stopped instantly. The silence was shocking after the prolonged assault, so complete that my ears rang in the sudden absence of noise. We stared at each other wordlessly, both recognizing the horrifying implication. Whatever was doing this was watching us, responding to our movements, our fear, our isolation. We mounted our bikes without another word and began pedaling as fast as the rough trail would allow. Behind us, a single deliberate crack echoed through the forest, a parting shot that followed us as we fled deeper into the woods. My legs pumped frantically, driven by pure terror, while branches whipped at my face and exposed roots threatened to send me sprawling. Every shadow seemed to conceal pursuing threats. Every curve in the trail felt like a potential ambush. The forest that had seemed merely intimidating the night before now felt actively hostile, as if the trees themselves were tracking our escape. Jordan rode ahead of me, setting a punishing pace that left no energy for conversation, but I could see the rigid tension in his shoulders, the way his head swiveled constantly to scan our surroundings. We didn't slow down until we reached the main road nearly 2 hours later, our legs burning from the sustained effort, and our nerves frayed beyond repair. The familiar sight of pavement and the distant hum of traffic felt like salvation after our ordeal in the wilderness. We collapsed beside our bikes, gasping and trembling, finally allowing ourselves to acknowledge what we'd experienced. "That wasn't normal," Jordan said finally, his voice hoarse from exertion and fear. "Trees they don't do that." I nodded mutely, still too shaken to trust my voice. The memory of those impossible sounds continued to replay in my mind, the violent cracking and crashing that had emerged from complete stillness, the way the noise had responded to our presence as if controlled by some invisible intelligence. In the days that followed, I found myself compulsively researching the area online, diving deep into forums and local history sites. Scattered reports emerged from the digital shadows, hikers describing unexplained sounds, campers fleeing in terror from invisible threats, stories dismissed by park officials as imagination or wildlife encounters. But the details were too consistent to ignore, too similar to our own experience to be mere coincidence. I discovered that the Olympic Hot Springs area held deep spiritual significance for local Native American tribes. considered sacred ground that demanded respect and caution from visitors. Some sites mentioned warnings passed down through generations about places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural world grew thin, where ancient guardians still protected the forest from unwelcome intrusion. The rational part of my mind rejected such explanations, clinging to scientific skepticism and logical analysis. But the terrified part, the part that had stood trembling beneath that motionless cedar tree while sounds of destruction rained down from empty air, recognized something profound in those traditional warnings. Some places in this world harbor forces beyond human understanding, entities that exist in the spaces between explanation and experience. Months later, Jordan suggested we return with a larger group, perhaps to investigate more thoroughly what we'd encountered. His proposal was casual, almost offhand, but I saw the lingering fear in his eyes that matched my own. I declined immediately, and he didn't press the issue. We both understood instinctively that some mysteries are best left unsolved, some territories better left unexplored. Even now, lying safe in my own bed in the city, I sometimes wake in the deep hours before dawn with the phantom sound of cracking branches echoing in my memory. I think about that cedar tree standing silent in the Olympic wilderness, keeping its secrets while something invisible and ancient moves through its crown. Whatever dwells in that forest revealed just enough of itself to warn us away, and I have no desire to test its patience by returning. The most terrifying aspect wasn't what we encountered, but what we didn't see. The complete absence of any visible source for sounds so violent and immediate created a horror far deeper than any creature or phenomenon we might have witnessed directly. In that absence, our imaginations filled the void with terrors far worse than reality could provide. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if other campers have experienced similar encounters in those remote woods, if the forest continues to guard itself against human intrusion through methods that science cannot explain. But mostly I try not to think about it at all. Some knowledge carries too heavy a price, and some questions are better left forever unanswered. The Olympic National Park remains on my list of places never to revisit. There are plenty of other forests, other trails, other adventures waiting that don't require confronting whatever ancient presence claims dominion over the abandoned Hot Springs Trail. That cedar tree can keep its secrets, and I'm content to keep my distance. In my weakest moments, usually in the darkest hours of sleepless nights, I find myself whispering desperate prayers to God for protection from things that exist beyond human comprehension. The forest taught me that our understanding of the natural world remains woefully incomplete, that forces older than civilization still move through the shadows, guarding territories we're not meant to enter. The wilderness is vast enough to accommodate both human visitors and whatever else calls it home, as long as we respect the boundaries that separate our worlds. I learned my lesson that February morning, and I have no intention of testing those limits ever again. My job at Steelton Industries was mined. I've always considered myself a resilient man, the kind who could weather life's storms with gritted teeth and a stiff upper lip. My name's Victor DeWitt, and back in 1995, I was trudging through a dead-end job in Pittsburgh, punching the clock in a soulless office building that seemed to suck the life out of everyone who entered its doors. The monotony of my days was soul-crushing. I'd wake up at 6 a.m., force down a bowl of tasteless cereal, and catch the 7:15 bus to downtown. The ride was always the same, packed with other lifeless workers, all of us avoiding eye contact, lost in our own worlds of quiet desperation. My job at Steelton Industries was mind-numbing. I was a data entry clerk, spending my days inputting endless streams of numbers into an ancient computer system that seemed to run on spite and coffee stains. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly overhead, a constant reminder of the artificial environment we'd trapped ourselves in. Lunch was a brief respite, usually a sad sandwich from the vending machine, eaten at my desk while I stared out the smudged window at the gray Pittsburgh skyline. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of the distant hills, a reminder of the world beyond these concrete walls. The afternoons dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. By the time 5 p.m. rolled around, I was mentally exhausted, my brain fried from the constant stream of meaningless data. The bus ride home was just as depressing as the morning commute, only now everyone looked even more defeated. Evenings were a blur of microwave dinners, mindless TV shows, and fitful sleep. But as I lay in bed each night, my thoughts would drift to the weekends, to the promise of escape that lay just beyond the horizon. You see, hiking was my solace, the one thing that kept me from going completely stir-crazy in this urban jungle. Every Saturday, without fail, I'd pack my gear, leave the city behind, and head into the mountains. It was my ritual, my way of keeping sane in a world that seemed determined to grind me down. I wasn't one to shy away from the tougher trails. In fact, the more remote, the better. There was something about being alone in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, that made me feel alive in a way nothing else could. It was on these trails that I felt like I could breathe again, like I was finally myself. As the work week dragged on, I found myself spending more and more time planning my weekend excursions. I'd pore over maps, research trails online, and chat with other hikers in forums about the best spots to explore. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I first heard about the trail that would change everything. It was a Tuesday night, and I was deep into a hiking forum, scrolling through posts about various trails in the Allegheny National Forest. That's when I saw it, a cryptic post from a user named Wilderness Wanderer. Anyone else heard about the unnamed trail off Route 66? Not on any map. Buddy of mine swears it's the most untouched piece of wilderness he's ever seen. Said it was like stepping back in time. The post had only a handful of replies, most of them skeptical. But one response caught my eye. I've been there. It's real, and it's not for the faint of heart. If you go, be prepared for anything. Some things are better left undisturbed. I felt a thrill run through me. This was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been looking for. I spent the next few nights digging deeper, trying to find any information I could about this mysterious trail. But details were scarce. Just whispers and rumors passed between hikers who claimed to know someone who'd been there. By Friday, I was obsessed. I'd cobbled together what little information I could find. A vague description of where the trailhead might be, warnings about its difficulty, and hints about strange experiences people had there. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to fan the flames of my curiosity. That night, as I packed my backpack, I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This wasn't like my usual hikes. There was an element of the unknown that both thrilled and unnerved me. I double-checked my gear, extra water, high-energy snacks, first aid kit, compass, and a detailed topographic map of the area where I thought the trail might be. As I zipped up my pack, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The man staring back at me looked different somehow. There was a gleam in his eye that I hadn't seen in years. It was the look of someone on the verge of an adventure. Little did I know just how life-changing that adventure would be. Saturday morning arrived with a chill in the air and a sky heavy with clouds. As I loaded my gear into my old Chevy pickup, I couldn't shake the feeling that this day was going to be different from any other. The drive to the Allegheny National Forest was long and winding. I left Pittsburgh behind, watching as the urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and then to the dense forests of northwestern Pennsylvania. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt, and the more my anticipation grew. It took hours of navigating, twisting back roads, following the vague directions I'd pieced together from online forums and whispered conversations. More than once, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn, finding myself on dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. Just as I was about to give up and turn back, I saw it, a small gap between two ancient oak trees, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. This had to be the trailhead I'd heard about. I parked my Chevy on the shoulder of the road and stepped out. The forest loomed before me, dark and primeval. The trees here were old, their trunks gnarled and massive, their branches reaching up to form a canopy so dense that little sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. As I shouldered my pack and approached the gap between the trees, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just the chill in the air. There was something about this place that felt off. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were strangely absent. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped onto the trail. Immediately, I felt like I'd entered another world. The path was narrow and overgrown, barely visible in places. It wound its way between the massive trees, twisting and turning in a way that made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the light began to dim, filtered through layers of leaves and branches. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the musty scent of decaying vegetation. I checked my watch. I'd only been walking for an hour, but it felt like much longer. The trail was challenging, just as the rumors had said. It climbed steeply at times, forcing me to scramble over moss-covered boulders and fallen trees. Other sections were boggy, my boots sinking into the soft earth with each step. But it wasn't just the physical difficulty that was getting to me. There was something else. A growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It started as a tickle at the back of my neck, a feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there, just the endless trees and shadows. As the day wore on, my unease grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming impossibly tall, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. More than once I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. I tried to rationalize these feelings, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I was miles from civilization, in a part of the forest that few people had ever seen. It was natural to feel a bit on edge. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something fundamentally wrong about this place. Something that went beyond mere isolation or unfamiliarity. It was as if the very air was charged with a malevolent energy, as if the forest itself was aware of my presence and was not happy about it. As the afternoon wore on and the light grew dimmer, I began to wonder if I should turn back. The trail was supposed to be a loop, but I had no idea how much further I had to go. The thought of being in this forest after dark filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. But just as I was about to give up and retrace my steps, I saw something through the trees ahead, a structure of some kind. My heart leaped. Maybe it was a ranger station or an old hunter's cabin. Either way, it meant shelter and possibly a way to orient myself. With renewed energy, I pushed forward, eager to reach the building and escape the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. But as I drew closer, my hope turned to confusion and then to a creeping horror. What I saw before me was no ranger station. It was something far older, far stranger, and far more terrifying. The structure that emerged from the gloom was a cabin, but unlike any I'd ever seen before. It looked ancient, as if it had stood in this clearing for centuries, weathering countless storms and seasons. The wood was gray with age, the windows boarded up with planks that were nearly as old as the cabin itself. The roof sagged ominously, laden with years of accumulated leaves and debris. As I approached, my steps slowing involuntarily, I noticed other details that sent chills down my spine. The clearing around the cabin was eerily perfect, a near circle of open ground surrounded by the dense forest. Not a single tree or bush grew within this circle, as if nature itself refused to encroach upon this place. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, the rotten wood threatening to give way. A sign was nailed to the door, its message barely legible under layers of dirt and moss. Do not enter. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back, to run as fast and as far as I could from this place. But something drew me forward, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't resist. My hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and pushed against the door. It swung open with a groan that sounded almost human, revealing the cabin's interior. The smell hit me first, a thick, musty odor of decay, and something else. Something I couldn't quite identify. It was sickly sweet, reminiscent of rotting meat but with an underlying scent that was alien and deeply unsettling. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the cabin's contents. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The furniture was old and broken, a table with one leg missing, chairs with their seats rotted away, shelves sagging under the weight of moldy books and rusted tools. But it was what lay in the center of the room that truly caught my attention. A trapdoor set into the floor, slightly ajar, and from beneath it that smell grew stronger, wafting up in almost visible waves. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Every fiber of my being was telling me to leave, to forget I'd ever seen this place. But my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me closer to that trapdoor. I can't explain why I did what I did next. Maybe it was the same morbid curiosity that gets us all into trouble at some point in our lives. Or maybe it was something more sinister, some external force compelling me forward. Whatever the reason, I found myself reaching down, grasping the iron ring set into the trapdoor, and pulling it open. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing in the empty cabin like a cry of pain. A set of stairs led down into darkness. A darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. The smell that rose from that opening was overwhelming now. I gagged, fighting the urge to vomit. But still, I didn't turn back. I couldn't. Something was calling to me from that darkness. Something ancient and terrible and undeniably real. Taking a deep breath, I began to descend the stairs. Each step creaked ominously, threatening to give way under my weight. The air grew colder as I went deeper, and I could have sworn I felt something brush against my skin, like cobwebs or ghostly fingers. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small chamber. My flashlight revealed walls that at first glance looked like they were covered in some kind of plaster. But as I looked closer, I realized with growing horror that the texture was all wrong. It was organic, almost alive, like the inside of some giant shell or the lining of a stomach. In the center of the chamber stood a table, and on that table, I'm still not sure how to describe what I saw. At first glance it looked like a pile of bones, bleached white with age. But as I drew closer, I realized that the bones were arranged in a pattern, an intricate and deliberate design that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And beneath the bones there was something else. A shape, a mass of flesh. It pulsated slightly, with a texture like raw meat. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Whatever this thing was, it was wrong. It didn't belong in this world. It was an abomination, a violation of every natural law I knew. I turned to leave, my only thought to get as far away from this place as possible. But then I heard it, a low, wet sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I whipped around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the chamber, and that's when I saw it. The thing on the table moved. Slowly, agonizingly, it began to rise. The bones clattered as they fell away, revealing more of the pulsating flesh beneath. And then I saw the eyes. They weren't human eyes. They weren't the eyes of any animal I'd ever seen. They were something in between, something that shouldn't exist. And they were looking directly at me. In that moment, as those alien eyes locked onto mine, I knew I had made a terrible, possibly fatal mistake. Whatever this thing was, it was aware. It was alive, and now it knew I was here. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't pause to think. I just ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time, my feet barely touching the ground. The darkness seemed thicker now, more alive, as if it was trying to pull me back down. I burst out of the cabin, gasping for air, and sprinted into the woods. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me as I ran. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I'm not sure how long I ran, or even in what direction. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. It wasn't until I finally reached my truck, out of breath and trembling, that I dared to look back. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, just a dark shape in the distance. But I could have sworn I saw movement, a shadow darker than the rest, watching me from the tree line. I threw my gear into the truck, jumped in, and tore out of there. The tires kicked up gravel as I sped down the road, not slowing down until I hit the main highway. Even then I kept driving, putting mile after mile between me and that forsaken place. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? With the image of those eyes burned into my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them staring back at me, alien and hungry. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation and the unfamiliar surroundings had caused me to hallucinate. Or maybe it was some elaborate hoax, a prank set up by locals to scare off city folk like me. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations were true. What I had seen in that cabin was real. It was dangerous. And somehow I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. I couldn't bring myself to go back to work. The thought of sitting in that office, inputting meaningless data while pretending everything was normal, was more than I could bear. I called in sick, using up vacation days I'd been saving for years. I spent days holed up in my apartment, jumping at every sound, convinced that somehow that thing from the cabin had followed me home. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the heart of the city. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. I went back to work, but everything felt different now. The mundane problems of office life seemed trivial compared to what I had experienced. My coworkers noticed the change in me. The dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched at sudden movements, the haunted look that never quite left my face. I couldn't bring myself to go hiking anymore. The thought of stepping into the woods filled me with a primal dread. My hiking gear gathered dust in the corner of my apartment, a reminder of the life I had lost. Nights were the worst. In the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I could swear I heard that wet, dragging sound again. Sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I thought I saw those eyes, glowing in the shadows. I became obsessed with researching the area where I had found the cabin. I spent hours online, digging through old newspaper archives and local history books. What I found only deepened the mystery. There were stories dating back centuries of strange disappearances in that part of the Allegheny National Forest. Native American legends spoke of an evil spirit that lived in the woods, luring travelers to their doom. Settlers in the 18th and 19th centuries reported encounters with something they couldn't explain, something that left them changed. But it was a series of more recent incidents that truly chilled me to the bone. Over the past few decades, there had been multiple cases of hikers going missing in that area. Some were never found. Others turned up weeks or months later, alive but profoundly altered. They spoke of lost time, of experiences they couldn't or wouldn't describe. Many never set foot in the woods again. As I delved deeper into these stories, I began to see connections, patterns that had been overlooked, and I realized with growing horror that what I had encountered in that cabin was part of something much larger and much older than I had initially thought. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I had to warn others, to prevent anyone else from stumbling upon that cursed place. But who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I had seen it with my own eyes. I started posting anonymously on hiking forums, warning people away from that area. I contacted the park rangers, spinning a story about dangerous terrain and unstable structures. I did everything I could to keep others away, all while knowing that it might not be enough. Months passed, and slowly, the acute terror of my experience began to fade into a chronic anxiety that colored every aspect of my life. I quit my job, unable to bear the confinement of the office any longer. I sold most of my possessions and moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, as far from the forests as I could get, while still maintaining some connection to my old life. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that it wasn't over, that somehow, someday, I would have to confront what I had seen in that cabin. That day came sooner than I expected. It was a crisp morning in late March, nearly 6 months after my encounter in the woods. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and scanning the local news on my laptop, when I saw the headline that made my blood run cold. Group of hikers missing in Allegheny National Forest. With shaking hands, I clicked on the article. 5 hikers, all experienced outdoorsmen, had vanished without a trace. The last known coordinates of their GPS trackers placed them in the exact area where I had found the cabin. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. I had tried to warn people, but it hadn't been enough. And now, more lives were at stake. I knew what I had to do, even though every instinct screamed against it. I had to go back. I had to find those hikers, or at least discover what had happened to them. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to end this once and for all. As I packed my bag, pulling my long-neglected hiking gear out of storage, I felt a mix of terror and determination. I didn't know what I would find when I returned to that forest, but I knew it would change me forever. I left a note in my apartment, detailing everything I had experienced and learned over the past months. If I didn't return, at least someone would know the truth. The drive back to the Allegheny National Forest was a journey into my own personal hell. Every mile brought back memories of that fateful day. Every turn in the road increased the dread building in my gut. But I pressed on, driven by a need to face what I had run from for so long. As I parked my truck at the now familiar spot and stepped out into the forest, I felt a shift in the air. The woods were silent, as they had been before, but there was a tension now, a feeling of anticipation. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I found the trail easily this time, my feet remembering the way, even after all these months. As I hiked deeper into the woods, I remained alert, watching for any sign of the missing hikers or anything else. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker around me. And then, just as before, I saw it through the trees, the cabin. It looked exactly as I remembered, a twisted parody of shelter in this wild place. But something was different this time. The door of the cabin stood open, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel, and from inside I heard sounds, movement, and something that might have been voices. Steeling myself, I approached the cabin. As I drew closer, I could make out words, spoken in a language I didn't recognize. The voices were strange, neither fully human nor completely alien. I stood at the threshold, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that stepping through that door might mean my death, or something far worse. But I also knew that I couldn't turn back now. Whatever was in there, whatever had taken those hikers, had to be stopped. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the cabin. The familiar musty smell hit me, along with that sickly sweet odor I remembered all too well. But now there was something else, the metallic tang of blood. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a scene of horror. The missing hikers were there, or what was left of them. Their bodies were arranged in a grotesque tableau, limbs twisted at impossible angles, flesh melded with the strange organic substance that coated the walls. And in the center of it all, rising from the open trapdoor, was the thing I had seen before. But it was larger now, more defined. I could make out limbs of a sort, and what might have been a head, and those eyes, those terrible knowing eyes, were fixed directly on me. I wanted to run. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee. But I stood my ground. I had come here for a reason, and I wouldn't leave until I had seen it through. The thing moved towards me, its form shifting and changing with each step. I could hear whispers in my mind, promises of power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. For a moment, I felt myself drawn to it, tempted by what it offered. But then I remembered the hikers, their broken bodies a stark reminder of the true nature of this entity. With a supreme effort of will, I shook off its influence. I don't know where I found the strength to do what I did next. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe some long-dormant instinct kicking in. But as the creature reached for me, I ducked under its grasp and lunged for the far wall of the cabin. My hands found what I was looking for, an old oil lamp, left behind by some long-ago inhabitant. In one fluid motion, I smashed the lamp against the wall and fumbled with my lighter. The flame caught immediately, feeding on the decades-old oil and the dry, rotted wood of the cabin. The fire spread with unnatural speed, as if the cabin itself was eager to burn. The creature let out a sound, not a scream, but a psychic howl that threatened to shatter my sanity. It recoiled from the flames, its form wavering and dissolving. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the woods. Behind me, I could hear the roar of the fire and that unearthly howling. The forest itself seemed to be screaming, the trees groaning and snapping in the heat. I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped and looked back, I saw a column of smoke rising above the trees, black and thick and somehow wrong. I made my way back to my truck in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. As I drove away from the forest, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I knew somehow that it was over. Whatever that thing had been, whatever ancient evil had taken root in those woods, it was gone now. The authorities later ruled the fire an accident, a campfire left unattended by careless hikers. The bodies of the missing group were never found, assumed to have been consumed by the blaze. I never told anyone the full story of what happened in those woods. Who would believe me? But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I remember the cabin, and the thing that lived beneath it. And I wonder, did I really destroy it? Or is it still out there, somewhere in the dark places of the world, waiting for its next victim? I may never know for sure. But one thing I do know, I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some things once seen can never be unseen, and some adventures are better left untaken. It was July 15th, 2023, when we set out on what was supposed to be a thrilling adventure into the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. I'm Hal, short for Halton, and at 28 years old, I thought I'd seen it all. Boy, was I wrong. The sun was just starting to peek over the tree line when we loaded up my old Ford F-150 for the trip. I'd been planning this hike for months. Just me and 3 of my closest buddies, heading way out into the woods where no one could find us unless they had a map and the will to follow it. And it wasn't just any forest either. We were headed to a place deep in the Appalachians, where people whispered about disappearances and weird stories that no one could ever explain. None of us really believed that crap, of course. We were just 4 guys looking for a thrill. A break from the monotony of our 9-to-5 lives. I was driving as usual, with Jonik riding shotgun. Jonik had some kind of Eastern European lineage and was always spouting conspiracy theories. In the back were Gabe and Benji. Gabe was short and wiry, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. Benji was the most level-headed, the calmest of us, and probably the only reason we hadn't gotten arrested on any of our previous trips. As we drove, the cityscape gradually gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The anticipation was palpable in the truck, a mix of excitement and nervous energy. We'd done plenty of camping trips before, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the stories we'd heard, or maybe it was just the knowledge that we were heading somewhere truly remote. It was Benji who first heard about the place. We were at our local bar, O'Malley's, about 2 months ago when he overheard a conversation between 2 older guys at the next table. They were talking in hushed tones about some obscure trail that wasn't on any official map. Benji, being the curious type, couldn't help but eavesdrop. One of the men, a local from a nearby town, was telling his friend about a trail that supposedly led to a cabin built sometime in the 1960s way up in the mountains. The thing was, no one could ever agree on where exactly it was. Some said it was just a legend, a story passed down through generations of hikers and hunters. Others claimed they'd been there but couldn't find their way back. And a few, the ones who'd had a few too many beers usually, swore that people who went looking for it never returned. Naturally, we decided we had to find it. We spent the next couple of months planning, gathering supplies, and trying to piece together the location from the fragments of information Benji had overheard. We pored over topographical maps, scoured online forums for any mention of the mysterious cabin, and even tried to track down the local guy from the bar. No luck on that last one. Seems he was just passing through town. By the time we parked the truck at what we hoped was the right trailhead, it was already mid-morning. The air was thick with humidity, and the forest around us buzzed with the sounds of insects and birdsong. We double-checked our gear one last time before shouldering our packs. "You sure this is the right place?" Gabe asked, eyeing the overgrown path skeptically. I shrugged. "As sure as we can be. This matches the description from that forum post at least." Jonik was practically vibrating with excitement. "Guys, do you realize what this could mean if we actually find it? We could be the ones to solve a decades-old mystery." Benjamin, ever the voice of reason, chimed in. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Right now, let's just focus on not getting lost." With that, we set off down the trail. At first, it wasn't anything special, just your typical Appalachian woods. Towering oaks and maples created a dense canopy overhead, dappling the forest floor with patches of sunlight. We saw the occasional deer darting between trees, and the distant sound of a stream kept us company as we hiked. We were all carrying enough gear to last the weekend. Tents, sleeping bags, plenty of food and water, and a couple of flasks of whiskey for good measure. Benji had also brought his hunting rifle, a decision that had sparked some debate during our planning sessions. He'd argued that it was just a precaution in case we ran into any aggressive wildlife. The rest of us had eventually agreed, figuring the worst we'd run into would be a black bear. No big deal, right? We hiked for a good 5 or 6 hours, taking breaks here and there to rest and rehydrate. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from work complaints to relationship drama, to wild speculations about what we might find at the end of our journey. "I bet it's some old moonshiner's hideout," Gabe joked during one of our breaks. "We'll find a still and enough white lightning to blind us all." "Nah," Jonik countered, his eyes gleaming with that look he got when he was about to launch into one of his theories. "I think it's something bigger. Maybe it's some kind of government facility, you know? Like where they do experiments or hide aliens or something." We all laughed at that, but there was an undercurrent of tension to our mirth. As the day wore on, and we pushed deeper into the wilderness, things started to change. The forest grew denser, the trees older and more gnarled. The underbrush became thicker, making our progress slower and more difficult. But it wasn't just the physical landscape that shifted. There was something else, something that set my nerves on edge. It took me a while to put my finger on it, but eventually, I realized what it was. The forest had gone quiet. No more bird song, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving us in an eerie stillness. "That's weird," Janek muttered, looking around like he expected something to jump out at him. I tried to wave it off. "It's just your imagination, man. The forest gets quiet sometimes." But it wasn't just that. It was like the whole world had decided to hold its breath, waiting for something. Even Gabe, who never shut up, was unusually quiet. "Hal," Benji said after a while, his voice low, "we should set up camp soon. We're running out of daylight." He was right. The sun was already dipping behind the ridge, casting long, creepy shadows between the trees. We found a decent spot by a small clearing, and set about setting up camp. By the time we had the tents pitched and a fire going, it was nearly dark. That's when things really started to feel off. It wasn't just the quiet anymore. There was this feeling that settled over us, like we weren't alone, like something was watching us. Not in the typical forest creature's way either. No, this was different, unnerving. Anyone else feel that? Gabe finally broke the silence, his eyes darting around the flickering firelight. Benji just nodded, his hand resting on the rifle by his side. Janek didn't say anything, but I could see him fiddling nervously with the strap of his backpack. I wasn't going to admit it, but yeah, something felt wrong. The shadows beyond our campfire seemed deeper, more menacing. Every snap of a twig in the darkness made us all jump. "Well," I said, trying to keep things light, "maybe we've just been out here too long. Forest does weird stuff to your head when it gets dark." "Or maybe," Janek said quietly, "it's the cabin." None of us laughed. We ate our dinner in relative silence, the crackling fire the only thing breaking it up. Then, after a while, Janek stood up. "I gotta take a piss," he muttered and wandered off into the trees. We waited for him to come back. 10 minutes passed, then 15. "Think he got lost?" Gabe asked, half joking but clearly nervous. "He wouldn't go far," I said, standing up. "I'll go check." I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the trees, calling his name. "Janek, you good, man?" Nothing. Just more of that damn silence. I walked further, the beam of my light cutting through the thick underbrush. But there was no sign of him. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something, a faint glow in the distance, like the reflection of moonlight on something metal. Curious, I moved closer. That's when I saw it. A truck. An old rusted-out truck, half covered in moss and leaves, parked in the middle of nowhere. "What the hell?" I called out for Janek again, but my voice just echoed back at me, swallowed by the trees. I backed up, ready to head back to camp, when I saw it, a flash of movement from behind the truck. I froze, staring into the darkness, but there was nothing. That's when I heard the scream. Janek's scream. I bolted back toward the camp, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I got there, Gabe and Benji were already on their feet, wide-eyed. "What the hell happened?" Gabe shouted. I don't know, I stammered. I heard him scream, but I didn't see anything. Benji grabbed his rifle and started toward the trees. "We're not leaving him out there. Let's go." We moved together, our flashlights cutting through the night. It wasn't long before we found something that made my stomach churn. It was Janek's hat, lying on the ground, torn. "Shit," Benji muttered, looking around, his grip tight on the rifle. "We need to get out of here," Gabe whispered, panic edging into his voice. "We're not alone out here." "Not without Janek," Benji growled. "We're not leaving him." We pressed on, calling his name. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the trees. At first I thought it was Janek, but as we got closer I realized it wasn't him at all. It was a man. An old man, with wild tangled hair and dirty clothes, staring at us with wide, unblinking eyes. He didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Who the hell are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer, didn't move, just kept staring. Benji raised his rifle. "Stay where you are, old man." That's when the man grinned. A wide, twisted grin that sent a chill down my spine. Suddenly, he bolted into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. "What the?" Gabe started, but he was cut off by another scream. This time, it was closer. Too close. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to find Janek. But when we reached the source of the scream, all we found was blood. A lot of it. It was smeared across the ground, leading deeper into the forest. Benji cursed under his breath, gripping his rifle like a lifeline. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But Benji wasn't listening. He was staring at the blood, his face pale. "Benji, come on," I shouted, grabbing his arm. Reluctantly, he nodded, and we turned to leave, only to find the old man standing right behind us, that same twisted grin on his face. He didn't say a word, didn't move, just grinned. And then, without warning, he lunged. Benji fired the rifle, the sound deafening in the stillness of the forest. The old man went down, but it didn't stop him. He kept crawling toward us, his fingers clawing at the dirt, that damn grin never leaving his face. "Run!" Benji shouted, firing again. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, leaving the old man behind, his eerie laughter echoing through the trees. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I could hear Gabe's panicked breathing behind me, and Benji's occasional curses as he brought up the rear. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that dark, twisted forest. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow held the potential for danger. More than once I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, darting figures just beyond the reach of our flashlights, always staying just out of sight. Finally, we burst out of the tree line and found ourselves back at the clearing where we'd set up camp. Our tents were still there, looking eerily undisturbed in the pale moonlight. We paused for a moment, all of us bent over, gasping for breath. What the hell was that thing?" Gabe panted, his eyes wide with fear. Benji shook his head, still gripping his rifle tightly. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now." "But what about Janek?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. The amount of blood we'd seen, there was no way. "We can't help him now," Benji said grimly. "We need to save ourselves." We quickly gathered what we could from the campsite, leaving the tents behind in our haste. As we were about to leave, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of twigs snapping, coming from the direction we'd just fled. "Go, go, go," I hissed, and we took off running again, this time heading in what we hoped was the direction of the truck. The forest seemed to be actively working against us now. Branches reached out to snag our clothes, roots rose up to trip us, and the darkness pressed in from all sides, threatening to swallow us whole. And all the while I could swear I heard that eerie laughter echoing through the trees, sometimes close, sometimes far away, but always there. By the time we made it back to the truck, it was nearly dawn. The sky was just beginning to lighten, turning from inky black to a deep bruised purple. We bolted for the vehicle, hearts pounding and lungs burning. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. Benji yanked open the passenger door, and Gabe, pale and silent, slid into the back seat without a word. Just as I was about to climb in, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the old man. He was too far away to make out clearly in the pre-dawn light, but I could see that twisted grin, those unblinking eyes fixed on us. I floored it the moment I got the engine started, not caring about the rough terrain or the bumps. We didn't say a damn thing as we tore down the narrow dirt road, the forest finally falling away behind us. We drove straight to the nearest town, a small place called Millerton. It was just starting to wake up as we rolled in, looking like we'd been through hell, which in a way, I suppose we had. Benji took out his phone, dialing the police with shaking hands. We waited in the parking lot of a small diner, all of us staring straight ahead, breathing heavily in the stale air of the truck. When the police arrived, they asked a lot of questions, but we couldn't answer most of them. How could we explain what we'd seen? Who would believe us? They sent out search parties, of course, but Janek wasn't found. Neither was the old man, or any evidence of what had happened to us that night. The official report chalked it up to a tragic hiking accident, possibly involving local wildlife. But we knew the truth. We'd seen something that night, something that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. Something that still haunts my nightmares. We never went camping again after that. How could we? The wilderness had shown us its true face, and it was far more terrifying than any of us could have imagined. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I think I can hear that eerie laughter again. And I wonder, is it just my imagination, or is there something out there watching, waiting for its next victims to wander into its domain? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but one thing's for certain, I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. It was a crisp October evening in 1992 when I, Gerald Martin, decided to take a week off from my job as a mechanic in Pittsburgh. At 43 years old, I was feeling the wear and tear of city life and yearned for some peace and quiet. I chose a small, lesser-known campground near the Allegheny National Forest called Whispering Pines. It seemed perfect for a solitary retreat in my old RV. My friend Leon Haggerty was supposed to join me, but he canceled at the last minute due to work commitments. So I set off alone, my trusty RV loaded with supplies for a week of camping. As I drove along the winding roads leading to Whispering Pines, the urban landscape gradually gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The autumn colors were in full swing, painting the scenery in vibrant shades of red, orange, and gold. It was a stark contrast to the gray streets of Pittsburgh I'd left behind. I arrived at the campground late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long shadows across the nearly empty grounds. Only a couple of other campers were scattered about, their RVs and tents barely visible through the trees. I found a secluded spot to park my RV, about 50 yards from the shoreline of a small lake. It was perfect, close enough to the water for easy access, but far enough back to give me some privacy. As I set up camp, I noticed an old pickup truck parked about 100 yards away, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. The truck looked like it had seen better days. Its once blue paint was now a patchwork of rust and faded color, and the tires seemed to be slowly sinking into the soft earth. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Probably belonged to some old-timer who used the lake as his private fishing spot. With the RV parked and leveled, I set up my folding chair by the water's edge. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the sky's fading light and the silhouettes of the surrounding pines. It was breathtaking, and for a moment I forgot all about the stress of my job and the nagging ache in my lower back that had been bothering me for months. As darkness fell, I lit a small campfire and heated up some canned soup for dinner. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just the occasional pop and crackle from the fire. It should have been peaceful, but something about the silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the area, partly to work off the meal and partly to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the lake shore. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the trees on the far side of the lake looked like dark sentinels standing guard. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the mud near the water's edge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail. It led away from the lake and towards the old pickup truck I'd noticed earlier. As I got closer, I saw a faint light coming from inside the truck's cab. My heart began to race. Someone was in there. I crept closer, trying to stay quiet. When I reached the truck, I peered through the cracked rear window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was hunched over in the back seat, surrounded by piles of ratty clothes and empty food cans. He was muttering to himself, his hands moving frantically as if searching for something. In the dim light of a battery-powered lantern, I could see that his clothes were torn and filthy, his hair a matted mess. I backed away slowly, not wanting to alert him to my presence. But as I turned to leave, I heard his mutterings more clearly. The words were still indistinct, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. It was a mix of fear and anger, punctuated by what sounded like quiet sobs. I hurried back to my RV, my mind racing. Who was that man? Why was he living in that old truck? Was he dangerous? I locked the door behind me and pulled down all the shades. I turned on the small TV, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts and calm my nerves. Hours passed, and I found myself drifting off to sleep despite my unease. But just as I was about to succumb to exhaustion, A sound jolted me awake, a soft, hesitant knock on the RV door. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I kept by the bed. It could serve as a weapon if needed, and approached the door cautiously.
Who's there?
I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response came, just another knock, more insistent this time. I said, "Who's there?" I repeated louder now. Finally, a voice answered, weak, raspy, barely above a whisper. "Please, help me." I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea, that I should call the police or simply drive away. But something in that voice, the raw desperation, made me pause. Slowly, I cracked open the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man from the truck stood there, looking even more haggard up close. His eyes were wild, darting back and forth as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "What do you want?" I asked, still not opening the door fully. "Please," he repeated, his voice shaking. "Someone's after me. He's going to kill me. I need help." I weighed my options quickly. We were miles from the nearest town, and cell reception out here was spotty at best. Even if I called the police, it could be hours before they arrived. And if this man was truly in danger, against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and opened the door. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let him enter. "But I'm warning you, any funny business and you're out. Got it?" He nodded frantically and stumbled inside. I directed him to sit at the small table while I fetched a bottle of water from the fridge. "What's your name?" I asked as I handed him the water. He gulped it down before answering. "Frank. My name's Frank." "Okay, Frank. Tell me what's going on. Who's after you?" Frank's hands shook as he set down the empty bottle. "I was hiking through the forest a few days ago when I came across this old cabin. It was raining, so I thought I'd take shelter inside. I thought it was abandoned, but..." He trailed off, his eyes going distant. "But what?" I prompted. "There was someone living there. A man. He wasn't right in the head. When he found me, he went berserk. Started screaming about trespassers and thieves. He had a knife." Frank's hand unconsciously went to his side, and I noticed a dark stain on his shirt that I hadn't seen before. "Jesus," I muttered. "Did you go to the police?" Frank shook his head vehemently. "I tried, but he followed me. He knows these woods better than anyone. Every time I thought I'd lost him, he'd show up again. I've been running for days. When I saw your RV, I hoped." Just then, a loud bang resonated through the RV, like something heavy hitting the side. I felt my heart skip a beat. "Stay here," I told Frank, grabbing my flashlight and the hunting knife I kept in a kitchen drawer. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, raising goosebumps on my skin. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to create moving shadows at the edge of my vision. I swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, seeing nothing out of place. I was about to head back inside when a low, menacing voice spoke from the darkness. "Where is he?" I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, a man tall and powerfully built. His face was hidden in the shadow of a hood, but I could see the glint of moonlight on the blade of a knife in his hand. "Get out of here!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave us alone!" The man took a step forward. "Give me the little rat, and I'll go. Otherwise..." He left the threat hanging in the air. I knew in that moment that there was no reasoning with this man. Whatever had happened between him and Frank, it had pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. I had to protect myself and the terrified man in my RV. I backed towards the door, keeping the flashlight trained on the intruder. Just as my hand found the handle, the man lunged forward with surprising speed. His knife slashed through the air where I had been standing a second before. Instinct took over. I swung the heavy flashlight with all my might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. I used that precious moment to dive into the RV, slamming and locking the door behind me. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled to Frank, who was cowering in the corner. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life just as the man outside began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. I threw the RV into drive and stomped on the gas. We lurched forward, tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. The attackers' enraged shouts faded as we sped away from the campsite, deeper into the forest on the narrow access road. For what felt like hours, we drove through the night. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every bend in the road a potential ambush. Frank sat silently in the passenger seat, jumping at every noise. Finally, we emerged from the forest and found ourselves on a main road. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a small town in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the bright fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the darkness we'd just escaped. "Wait here," I told Frank. I went inside, explained the situation to the startled waitress, and used the phone to call 911. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. I recounted the whole story to the officers. The footprints by the lake, the man in the truck, the attack at the RV. They took Frank into custody, assuring me they would get him the medical and psychological help he clearly needed. As I watched them drive away, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The ordeal was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly finished. The attacker's face, hidden by that hood, haunted my thoughts. He was still out there somewhere, in those dark woods, waiting. I spent the rest of the night in the RV, parked under the bright lights of the diner. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my normal life, not yet. The shadow of that night loomed too large. I needed time to process, to heal. I packed up the RV, made sure I had enough supplies, and set off down the highway. I had no destination in mind, just a need to keep moving, to put distance between myself and Whispering Pines. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, I could find peace again. But for now, all I could do was keep driving, keep fighting the memories, and hope that somewhere down this long road, I would find the solace I so desperately sought. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself wandering from town to town, never staying in one place for too long. The fear of the hooded man finding me kept me moving, even though rationally I knew he couldn't possibly know where I was. I picked up odd jobs here and there, fixing cars in small garages, doing handyman work for cash. It wasn't much, but it kept gas in the RV and food on the table. More importantly, it kept my mind occupied, preventing it from dwelling too much on that fateful night. One evening, about a month after the incident, I found myself in a small town in Ohio. I'd stopped at a local bar, hoping a drink might help me sleep better that night. As I nursed my beer, I overheard a conversation at the next table that made my blood run cold. "I'm telling you, Jim, something weird is going on in those woods," a gruff voice was saying. "My cousin works for the Forestry Service up there, and he says they've been finding these strange markings on trees, like claw marks, but bigger than any bear he's ever seen." "Aw, come on, Bill," his companion replied. "You know your cousin likes to exaggerate. Probably just some kids messing around." "Nah, it's not just that," Bill insisted. "There've been sightings too. Hikers reporting a large dark figure moving through the trees. And get this, a couple of campers went missing last week. Search and rescue found their campsite torn to shreds, but no sign of the people." I didn't stick around to hear the rest of the conversation. I left some money on the bar and hurried back to my RV, my heart pounding. Could it be related to what I'd experienced? Or was I just being paranoid, seeing connections where there were none? That night, I dreamt of the hooded man. In my dream, he stood at the edge of a dark forest, his face still hidden, but as I watched, he began to change. His body elongated, his fingers stretching into claws. The hood fell back, revealing not a human face, but something other. I woke up in a cold sweat, the image seared into my mind. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running forever. I needed answers, even if getting them meant facing my fears. I pointed the RV back towards Pennsylvania, towards the Allegheny National Forest. As I drove, I tried to piece together a plan. I couldn't go back to Whispering Pines. The memories were too raw, and I didn't want to risk running into the hooded man again. But maybe I could find that old cabin Frank had mentioned. If it really existed, it might hold some clues about what was going on. I arrived at the outskirts of the forest late in the afternoon. I found a small motel to stay the night. not wanting to camp in the RV so close to where everything had happened. That evening, I went to a local diner, hoping to gather some information. The waitress, a friendly middle-aged woman named Donna, seemed happy to chat as she refilled my coffee. When I casually mentioned I was thinking of doing some hiking in the area, her smile faltered. "Be careful out there," she said, lowering her voice. "There's been some strange goings-on in those woods lately." I feigned innocence. "Oh? What kind of strange goings-on?" Donna glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Well, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there's been talk of some kind of creature out there. People have been seeing things, hearing things. A couple of hikers even went missing last month." My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. "A creature? What? Like a bear?" She shook her head. "No, something bigger and smarter from what I hear. Look, I'm not saying I believe all the stories, but just be careful, okay? Stick to the main trails and don't go wandering off alone." I thanked her for the advice and left the diner, my mind whirling. The stories matched what I'd overheard in Ohio. Whatever was happening here, it was bigger than just one incident in a campground. The next morning I set out early, my backpack loaded with supplies. I'd studied maps of the area, trying to pinpoint where the cabin Frank had mentioned might be. It was a long shot, but it was all I had to go on. The forest was beautiful in the early morning light, mist curling between the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapping twig made me jump. I'd been hiking for a couple of hours when I came across an overgrown path branching off from the main trail. It looked rarely used, almost hidden by the dense foliage. My instincts told me this could be what I was looking for. As I ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew taller and denser, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air became thick and humid, filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp wood. I pushed on, my senses on high alert. After about an hour of difficult hiking, the path opened up into a small clearing, and there, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, stood an old, dilapidated cabin. My heart raced as I approached it cautiously. This had to be the place Frank had mentioned. The cabin was in even worse shape than I had imagined. The roof had partially caved in, and one wall was leaning dangerously. Nature was reclaiming it, with vines and moss covering much of the exterior. As I got closer, I noticed deep gouges in the wood of the doorframe, claw marks, far larger than any animal I'd ever encountered. I hesitated at the threshold, my hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. Did I really want to go inside? What if the hooded man was still using this place? Or worse, what if the creature people had been talking about was real and this was its lair? But I'd come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The interior of the cabin was a mess of broken furniture and debris. Dust motes danced in the beams of light filtering through the holes in the roof. I stepped carefully, mindful of the rotting floorboards. In one corner, I saw what looked like a makeshift bed, a pile of old blankets and clothes. Nearby was a stack of canned food, some opened recently. As I explored further, something caught my eye. Pinned to one wall was a large map of the forest, covered in markings and notes. I moved closer to examine it, my flashlight illuminating the faded paper. Red X's marked various locations throughout the forest, with dates scribbled next to them. Some of the dates corresponded with the missing hikers I'd heard about. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I might be looking at. A record of attacks or abductions. But why? What was the purpose behind all this? Suddenly, a noise outside made me freeze. It sounded like heavy footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall next to the window. The footsteps stopped right outside. Through a crack in the boarded-up window, I could make out a large, dark shape. It was hunched over, much taller and broader than any man I'd ever seen. As it turned its head, I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes and a muzzle full of sharp teeth. I held my breath, terrified that even the slightest sound would give me away. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. For a moment I was sure it had detected my presence. But then, to my immense relief, it moved away, its heavy footsteps fading into the forest. I waited several minutes before daring to move, my legs shaky from the adrenaline. What I had just seen defied explanation. It wasn't human, but it wasn't any animal I recognized either. Was this the creature people had been talking about? And if so, what was its connection to the hooded man? I knew I needed to get out of there, fast. But I couldn't leave empty-handed. Quickly, I used my phone to take pictures of the map and the rest of the cabin's interior. Then, moving as quietly as I could, I made my way back outside. The forest seemed different now, more menacing. Every shadow could be hiding that creature waiting to pounce. I moved as quickly as I dared back towards the main trail, constantly looking over my shoulder. It was late afternoon by the time I made it back to my RV. I locked the doors and sat there for a long time trying to process what I had seen. The creature in the woods, the map in the cabin, the missing hikers, it all pointed to something sinister happening in these forests. But what could I do about it? Who would believe me if I told them? As night fell, I made a decision. I couldn't just walk away from this. Not when people's lives might be in danger. I needed to gather more evidence to understand what was really going on, but I also knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed help. The next morning, I drove to the nearest town with a reliable internet connection. I spent hours researching, looking for any information about similar sightings or incidents in other forests. To my surprise, I found several accounts from across the country. Stories of hikers encountering large unknown creatures, of strange disappearances in national parks. One name kept coming up in my research. Dr. Laura Chen, a cryptozoologist who specialized in investigating reports of unknown animals. She had written several papers on the possibility of undiscovered large primates in North American forests. If anyone would take my story seriously, it would be her. It took some doing, but I managed to get in touch with Dr. Chen. At first, she was skeptical of my story, but when I sent her the photos I'd taken in the cabin, her tone changed. She agreed to meet me in person to discuss what I'd seen. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Dr. Chen in a small cafe in Pittsburgh. She was younger than I expected, probably in her early 40s, with a sharp, intelligent gaze that seemed to take in every detail. "Mr. Martin," she said after I'd recounted my experiences, "what you're describing is fascinating. If what you saw is real, it could be the discovery of the century." "If it's real?" I echoed, a bit offended. "I know what I saw, Dr. Chen." She held up a hand placatingly. "I believe that you believe what you saw, but in my line of work, I've learned to be cautious. Eyewitness accounts can be unreliable, especially in high-stress situations. That said, the evidence you've gathered, the photos, the map, those are compelling. I'd like to investigate further." I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. On one hand, I was glad to have someone take me seriously. On the other, the thought of going back into those woods terrified me. But I knew I had to see this through. "What's our next step?" I asked. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "We go back to the forest. We set up cameras, gather physical evidence. If this creature is real, we need to document it properly. But we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's dangerous. We can't risk alerting it to our presence." Over the next few weeks, Dr. Chen and I made several trips into the Allegheny National Forest. We set up motion-activated cameras near the old cabin and in other areas where sightings had been reported. We collected hair samples, made plaster casts of strange footprints we found. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Our breakthrough came on a cold, misty morning, about a month into our investigation. We were checking the cameras when we heard a loud crash in the distance, followed by an inhuman roar that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Dr. Chen and I exchanged a look of excitement and fear. Without a word, we began moving towards the sound, our cameras at the ready. As we crept through the underbrush, the mist seemed to thicken, reducing visibility to just a few yards. Suddenly, a massive shape burst out of the mist right in front of us. It was the creature I had seen at the cabin, but in the daylight I could see it more clearly. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and something almost human, with intelligent eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the three of us, Dr. Chen, myself, and this impossible creature, stared at each other. Then, with another ear-splitting roar, it turned and vanished back into the mist. Dr. Chen and I stood there, stunned into silence. Finally, she turned to me, her face pale but her eyes shining. "Did you get that on camera?" she asked breathlessly. I nodded. my hands shaking as I checked the camera. The encounter had lasted only seconds, but it was there, captured in high definition, proof that the creature was real. But our elation was short-lived. As we turned to head back to our camp, we found our path blocked by a familiar figure, the hooded man. He stood there silently, his face still hidden in shadow, a hunting rifle cradled in his arms. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This doesn't concern you." "Who are you?" I demanded. "What's going on here?" The man was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached up and pushed back his hood. I gasped as I recognized his face. It was Frank, the man I had helped escape that night at the campground. But he looked different now, older, harder, with a wild look in his eyes. "My name isn't Frank," he said. "It's William Blackwood. My family has been protecting these forests and its secrets for generations. That creature you saw? It's ancient, powerful. Some call it a guardian spirit, others a monster. But it's part of these woods, part of the balance of nature here. And now, because of your meddling, that balance is threatened." Dr. Chen stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. "But don't you see? This is an incredible discovery. We could learn so much." William cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Learn? You think you can study it like some animal in a zoo? This creature has been here since before humans walked these lands. It's not meant to be understood by our limited minds. It's meant to be respected, feared, left alone." I could see the fanaticism in his eyes, the absolute conviction in his words. This man truly believed he was protecting something greater than himself. But at what cost? "The missing hikers," I said, realization dawning. "Was that you?" William's face hardened. "Sometimes sacrifices must be made to maintain the balance, to keep people away, to feed the guardian. It's not pretty, but it's necessary." I felt sick to my stomach. This man had been luring innocent people to their deaths, all in service of some misguided belief in a forest spirit. "You're insane," I said. "We have to tell the authorities." William raised his rifle. "I can't let you do that. I'm sorry, but you've seen too much. The secret must be protected, at any cost." Time seemed to slow down. I saw William's finger tightening on the trigger. I heard Dr. Chen's sharp intake of breath beside me. And then, from behind William, came a deafening roar. The creature burst out of the mist, moving faster than something that size had any right to. Before William could react, it was upon him. There was a sickening crunch, a cut-off scream, and then silence. Dr. Chen and I stood frozen in horror as the creature turned towards us. Its muzzle was stained with blood, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intelligence. For a long moment, it regarded us silently. Then, to my amazement, it spoke. Its voice was deep, resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You have seen. You have learned. Now you must choose. Speak of this, and the balance will be forever broken. Keep our secret, and the forest will thrive." With that, it turned and loped off into the mist, leaving us alone with the broken body of William Blackwood. Dr. Chen and I looked at each other, shocked beyond words. We had come seeking answers, but now we were left with an impossible choice. Reveal the truth and risk destroying something ancient and powerful, or keep the secret and live with the knowledge of what was happening in these woods. In the end, we chose silence. We buried William's body deep in the forest and destroyed all the evidence we had gathered. The world wasn't ready for this truth, we decided. Maybe it never would be. I still think about that day often, even now, years later. Sometimes when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear a distant roar echoing through the trees, and I wonder if we made the right choice. But one thing I know for certain, there are secrets in this world, ancient and powerful, that are better left undiscovered. And the next time you find yourself in a dark, quiet forest, remember this: you are not alone, and you are not at the top of the food chain. The woods are watching, always watching. If there's one thing I've learned after 7 years working as a park ranger in the Chiricahua National Monument, it's that nothing truly surprises me anymore. At least that's what I thought until that fateful night in October 2019. My name's Connor Bissell, and I'm about to tell you a story that'll make you question everything you think you know about the natural world. I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, a desert kid through and through. When I first got assigned to Chiricahua, I didn't expect to fall in love with the forest, but there was something about this place that got under my skin. It's not like other parks. It's quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It's like the land itself is just holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Over the years, I've had my fair share of close calls with nature. Rattlesnakes, mostly. We've had bears and bobcats, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. That's why when two hikers stumbled into the ranger station back in early 2019, babbling about something stalking them through the dense forests, I chalked it up to paranoia. They swore it was bigger than a mountain lion, moved faster than anything they'd ever seen. I listened, nodded, and filed the report away without giving it much thought. It was a crisp autumn night when everything changed. I was working a late patrol, probably one of the last ones before I'd pack it in for the night. Our shifts can run long when there's no one else around, and I don't mind the quiet. The radio was dead, and the night was just like it always was. Pitch black, with a sky full of stars that felt way too close. I don't like using the flashlight much. It's too bright, ruins the peace. So I was walking in the dark, trusting my eyes to adjust as they always did. The trail I was on runs parallel to a stretch of deep woods, and that's when I first caught a glimpse of something moving through the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it. Wildlife is active at night, and I've seen plenty of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But as I continued down the trail, I noticed something off about the movement. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either. Just a hulking shape shifting between the trunks, keeping pace with me. My first thought was that it must be a black bear. Bears can get big out here, especially if they're feeding well before hibernation. But then it stopped, dead still. Now animals don't just stop moving without reason. Not like that. I stood still for a moment, scanning the shadows with my flashlight. My beam caught a flash of something pale, and that's when I realized this wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It stepped into the clearing, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The creature was tall, probably a good 7 or 8 feet. Its legs were long and gangly, with joints that seemed wrong, like they didn't quite bend the way a mammal's should. But what really got me was its skin. It wasn't fur. It wasn't anything natural looking. It was smooth, almost like sickly pale leather, stretched tight over its bones. I stood there frozen, trying to figure out what kind of animal I was dealing with. I've seen mountain lions, elk, all manner of creatures, but nothing like this. Its face had a snout, long and narrow, but not like a dog or a wolf, more like a crocodile, but without the scales. Its mouth was open, hanging slightly as if it was smelling the air, and inside there were rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Teeth that didn't belong in any animal I'd ever read about. I reached for my radio, but then the thing moved. It didn't charge, didn't make a sound, it just walked, slow and deliberate toward the trees again, disappearing into the darkness as silently as it had come. I stood there staring at the spot where it vanished, my heart hammering. That thing had been close enough to me that I could hear its labored breathing, almost like it was struggling to stay alive. I wasn't about to chase it into the woods. I mean, come on, I may be a park ranger, but I'm not suicidal. Instead, I kept walking down the trail, eyes darting left and right, trying to make sense of what I saw. The forest was dead silent after that. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even a single chirp from a cricket. That's when I knew something was wrong. Animals don't just vanish like that. They scatter, they hide. But this was something else. A good hour went by before I saw anything unusual again. By that point, I had almost convinced myself that I'd been seeing things. Maybe a trick of the light, I thought. Maybe a weird shadow. But deep down, I knew better. I've spent years in these woods. I know every rock, every tree, every sound that comes with the night. As I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I found myself jumping at every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves. The forest, which had always been my home away from home, suddenly felt alien and hostile. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic pet, I thought, or a bear with mange. But even as I considered these possibilities, I knew they didn't fit. What I'd seen was something entirely different, something that shouldn't exist in our world. As the hours ticked by, I found myself circling back to the area where I'd first spotted the creature. Part of me hoped I'd find some evidence. Tracks, fur, Anything that could prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. But the forest floor was undisturbed, showing no signs of the massive being that had passed through earlier. Just as I was about to call it a night and head back to the ranger station, I saw it again. This time it was closer, standing on the ridge just ahead of me. Its silhouette was impossible to mistake, especially with the moonlight behind it. I froze. This time, I noticed something else. It wasn't alone. There were two of them. The second one was smaller, thinner, but equally twisted, with the same long limbs and pale, leathery skin. They stood together, motionless, watching me. I could feel their presence like a weight pressing on my chest. But I couldn't move. I didn't want to show fear. Hell, I didn't know what else to do. Standing still didn't feel any better. One of them let out a low, rasping breath. It wasn't quite a sound, more like air moving through dry leaves. My hand instinctively reached for the knife strapped to my belt. I wasn't armed with a gun. Not that it would have made much difference against whatever these things were. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a scream. A human scream. From deep within the woods. It was sharp, cut short, and unmistakably a man's voice. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or instinct, but I bolted toward the sound. Running through those woods in the dark is about the worst thing you can do. But I couldn't just stand there. I had to know. The scream led me to a small clearing, but when I got there, it was already too late. A man, middle-aged by the look of him, lay face down in the dirt, unmoving. His body was torn open in places that I don't care to describe in detail. Let's just say it was brutal, and leave it at that. But those things, they were gone. I radioed it in, calling for backup. Of course, it took forever for anyone to get there. By the time they did, I had already searched the area, but there was no sign of the creatures. Not a trace. When my colleagues arrived, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but you can imagine how that went. Blank stares, questions that danced around the fact that they didn't believe a word I was saying, but the man's body was there, lying in a pool of his own blood. That part was real enough. They chalked it up to an animal attack. A mountain lion, maybe. The local authorities took over, said they'd handle the investigation. I wasn't going to argue. What was I supposed to say? That two gangly crocodile-faced creatures from some nightmare had been stalking me through the woods and killed a man? No one would believe that. The official report said it was a big cat, but I know what I saw. I didn't go back to that section of the park for a while. Couldn't bring myself to, but curiosity has a way of pulling you back in. About a month later, I ventured into the same area. Not because I wanted to see those things again, but because part of me needed closure. Closure I didn't think I'd get. That's when I found it. A bone half buried in the dirt near where the man had died. It wasn't human. Too long, too thin, and the end was snapped like it had been chewed on. I stood there for a long while, staring at it, not sure what to make of it. But I didn't touch it, didn't want to. I left it where it lay, turned and walked back down the trail. Whatever those things were, they were still out there. I couldn't prove it, not in a way anyone else would believe. But I didn't need to, they knew, and so did I. In the weeks that followed, I found myself questioning everything. Every shadow in the forest seemed to hide one of those creatures. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the reports started coming in. Hikers claiming to have seen strange, pale figures moving through the trees at dusk. Campers waking up to find their sites ransacked, with no signs of bears or other wildlife. And always that eerie silence that seemed to follow in the wake of these sightings. I started keeping a log, documenting every incident, every detail I could gather. I knew I was onto something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. Despite my better judgment, I began spending more time in the area where I'd first encountered the creatures. I set up trail cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of them on film. Night after night I'd return to check the footage, only to find nothing but the usual forest animals. But then, one evening I hit pay dirt. The camera had captured something moving through the frame, just at the edge of its range. The image was blurry, indistinct, but there was no mistaking that elongated silhouette, those unnaturally long limbs. I took the footage to my supervisor, hoping that this would be the evidence I needed to prove I wasn't crazy. But as we reviewed the video together, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He suggested it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe just a trick of the light. I knew then that I was on my own. If I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. It was a cold November night when everything came to a head. I was on my usual patrol, skirting the edge of the area where I'd had my encounters. The air was thick with fog, limiting visibility to just a few feet in front of me. That's when I heard it. That same rasping breath I'd heard before. But this time, it was coming from behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and found myself face to face with one of the creatures. It was even more terrifying up close. Its eyes were milky white, with no pupils that I could see. Its skin seemed to pulse and shift in the beam of my flashlight, as if it couldn't quite hold its shape. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my radio. But before I could call for help, the creature spoke. Its voice was like gravel being ground together, barely recognizable as language, but I understood it all the same. "We've been waiting for you, Connor," it said, and that's when I realized the truth. These weren't some unknown species of animal. They weren't from our world at all. They were something else entirely, something that had been watching us, studying us, for who knows how long. As more of them emerged from the fog surrounding me, I knew that my life as I knew it was over. The Chiricahua National Monument wasn't just a park. It was a gateway, and I had just stumbled through it. I'm writing this down now, in the hopes that someone will find it and understand what's happening here. The creatures, they call themselves the Whispers. They've shown me things that I can't unsee. Realities beyond our own, existing alongside ours, separated by the thinnest of veils. They say they need me, that I'm important somehow, but I don't know if I can trust them. All I know is that the forest isn't what we thought it was. It's alive in ways we never imagined, and it's hungry. If you're reading this, be careful out there. The shadows are deeper than you think, and what's lurking in them, well, let's just say it's not something you'll find in any guidebook. Remember, the silence is your first warning. When the forest goes quiet, that's when you know they're near. And if you hear that rasping breath, run, run. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Run, and hope that whatever's out there doesn't catch up to us. But deep down, I think we all know the truth. It's already here. It's been here all along, and it's only a matter of time before it decides to step out of the shadows and show itself to the rest of the world. God help us all when it does.